Hi everyone, this is Alan Mckay. Welcome to episode 170. I'm speaking with the writers at Cinefex magazine on the last 40 years of visual effects and movie making. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Alan Mckay podcast. Alan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Alan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Alan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on alanmckay.com.
Have you ever sent in your reel wondering why you didn't get the callback? Or what was the reason you didn't get the job? Here's the thing, most of us think you just put your latest work on your reel to some cool music and send it off, and then you get the job. A lot of us aren't aware that the majority of the reels sent to studios are skipped through and sometimes never even watched in the first place. The fact is, everything we're taught about landing a job as an artist is wrong. Over the past 20 years working for studios like Industrial Light and Magic, Ubisoft, Blur Studio, I built hundreds of teams, hired thousands of artists, and reviewed tens of thousands of reels. That's why I decided to write a book from the perspective of somebody that actually does the hiring. Learn the exact formula to captivate and qualify you as the obvious artist for the job, how to build a reel that ranks high on YouTube and attracts studios to you. The best part is with this book, you can get it right now absolutely free. Whether you're in design, games, TV, or film, go over to alanmckay.com/myreel. Hi everyone, so welcome to a brand new episode. I say it a lot, but I'm really excited for this one. Honestly, this has been one I've been looking forward to putting out for some time, and I'm sure 99.9% of you all know who Cinefex is. Cinefex is a quarterly magazine that's been coming out since the dawn of time, documenting the entire film industry. It's not just visual effects, but special effects and movie magic in general. And I think for a lot of us, we all grew up on this. This is something that, when I say magazine, it doesn't do it justice. You would get this very oddly shaped, very amazing book in the mail, or you'd go and buy it at Borders or wherever, and typically everyone would have a stack of these on their desk, and you would flick through it and read up about the latest films and interviews with all the VFX soups and other people involved, whether it was model making or whether it was VFX and makeup and everything else too. But it's just been something that was always the backbone for all of us to kind of keep in the loop with everything going on long before the internet. And even with the internet, there's something about the authenticity of having Cinefex magazine, being able to read about it and everything else. So getting to sit down with Jody and Graham at Cinefex and discuss the whole history of Cinefex and discuss many really amazing stories about Cinefex and about many iconic films, it's been really interesting and really inspiring and just a lot of fun to do. And I'd rather not have some big formal wind-up. I'd rather just get into this episode because, again, there's so much great information and great knowledge shared and just a whole history of movie making that gets discussed in this episode, and also the extra episode, episode 171, which will be out later this week. So definitely check out the show notes, alanmckay.com/170, and you'll be able to access any additional information, as well as link to the latest issue of Cinefex magazine, which is out right now, with loads of killer content, everything from Aquaman and Welcome to Marwen, which I interviewed Kevin Bailey on this project a couple of episodes back, and a big Q&A with Robert Zemeckis and the director of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea as well. So loads of really cool stuff, and every issue has always been really amazing. So check out the show notes, alanmckay.com/170, and I'm going to dive into this episode now with Jody and Graham, and there'll be a second part to this because we go through so much stuff and it's all really amazing content. So the second episode, episode 171, will be out later this week as well. Okay, let's dive in. Thanks guys for taking the time to chat. I'm really excited for this. Do you guys want to quickly introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Jody Duncan. I'm the editor of Cinefex magazine. I've been with the magazine in one capacity or another from the beginning, starting with kind of clerical work and then worked up to editor since 1992.
Wow. I wasn't even born yet. Kidding. I'm totally kidding. That's amazing. That's so cool.
And I'm Graham Edwards. I'm senior staff writer at Cinefex. I've been with the magazine for, I guess, about 5 years now. I started as blog editor, started up the blog initially, and then kind of moved sideways after doing that for a couple of years to be full-time on the staff writing articles for the magazine while still keeping the blog going.
That's really cool. And I guess, like, starting out, I mean, can you guys describe like what Cinefex is? I mean, I feel like it's such an iconic piece of all of our industries, but just for that one or two people.
Go ahead, Graham.
Well, Cinefex is, as it has been since issue 1, the Journal of Cinematic Illusions, which is really sort of the critical line that you need to remember when thinking about Cinefex. Even in these days of visual effects leading the field, in some people's eyes, our mission, as we see it, is always to start with what are the cinematic illusions in this film. So we like to cover visual effects, special makeup effects, creature effects, miniature effects. Sometimes that leaks into kind of production design, maybe cinematography. We always like to talk to the directors. My colleague, Joe Fordham, who we should also mention here, Joe is the third part of our tripartite editorial team. He's associate editor, and along with Jody and I, writes all the articles. Between the three of us, we write all the articles for the magazine. He always likes to use the phrase soup to nuts. So we like to start at the beginning, work our way all the way through to the end, and within that, just find the story of what is it that this film is putting on the screen, and how did they do it.
I love it. And I guess, like, we'll get into this a little bit later, but you're absolutely right about, covering it more as illusions, because you're right, there's so many evolutions of what we're doing, and visual effects, I think, is one that definitely has become the big focus for a lot of different reasons in terms of eye candy and, attention-grabbing stuff. But, I mean, a lot of the similar techniques are still used today, and I'm kind of really curious to see where the future goes too. I mean, who's to say that we'll be doing things the way we are right now, even 10 years from now. So it's always an evolution, I think, with the filmmaking process. So I love the fact that you guys have documented every aspect throughout the whole history of special effects and visual effects, which is really cool. And I guess, Jody, I mean, how did Cinefex first get started? I mean, can you shed a bit of light on the history of the magazine?
Sure. The founder, Don Shay, who just retired a couple of years ago, very happily, he had written some big articles. He did a big Close Encounters of the Third Kind article for Cinefantastique, if you recall that magazine.
Yeah, I do vaguely.
Yeah, and kind of just had a different idea of how he wanted to do it. Since Cinefantastique wasn't really visual effects only, it kind of branched off into other things more. And Don thought that the technology and the art of it had gotten to a point where it really deserved its own dedicated magazine. So he decided to start it. And he worked on the first issue, did everything, that first issue. And I mean everything. And this is 1978. So you can imagine it was a very analog and laborious process. And he wrote everything and did everything, and took him a year, and he got that first issue out. And it looked remarkably like it does now. A lot of magazines kind of almost start off as Xerox newsletters or something, and then they kind of grow. Cinefex #1, except for being a staple bind instead of the binding we have now, pretty much looks like Cinefex looks now, that weird shape, and the quality of the photography and all of that was right there from issue 1, because that was very important to Don. And then so now we had a magazine. How do we get it out there? So Don and I actually took boxes of them around to comic book stores in LA. And at one I'll never forget this, at one comic book store, they happened to have a representative from a distributor there when we walked in. And the guy sat and looked at the magazine and said, well, it's nice looking, but this is never going to work. this is a weird shape. It's going to get lost behind the other magazines. How much did this cost you per issue to do this? And Don told him, he said, well, that'll never work. You'll never make a profit on this. And he was almost right about that. But how come there's no advertising? I mean, the distributor rep just shot us down totally. So it was very grassroots, homespun, ma and pa kind of operation. And we went to the science fiction convention in Boston, I guess in 79 or 80, one of those, I guess 80, and had a booth there. And I think that kind of helped. We were just handing out subscription cards everywhere. And that's how it started.
That's really cool. And I guess talking to that distributor, did you find kind of like the harsh questions at all kind of help you have some realizations at all? Like, let's say with
No, Don didn't change a thing.
Cool.
That's the thing about Don. He is the immovable object, and
he's the rock.
Yes, and as much of an irresistible force as this rep was, it didn't move. He did not change one thing. He didn't change the cost. He didn't change the quality. He didn't change the shape. He didn't change nothing. This is how he do it, and that's how he did it.
Well, that's good. I mean, if you got a vision in your mind, sticking to it, I think is, it's definitely got its advantages. So I think that's great. That's really cool. And yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this last night. Like, I used to make jokes all the time whenever we finish a movie and we got to do all the behind the scenes making of stuff and take photos and do all that. So I'd always be like, quick Cinefex pose, and like point at the screen, and everyone else kind of, gathers around your monitor or whatever. And so it's always kind of been one of those things that, all of us kind of take for granted has been part of our industry always. And for you guys in the beginning, I mean, did you always did you have any anticipation about like how well Cinefex would be received in the movie industry? Because like everyone has at least a couple of issues like lying on their desk or in the bookshelf behind them. I mean, is this something that you flick through and you kind of need that bit of inspiration or traction with what you're doing?
Did we anticipate it? No. I don't think so. I don't think Don went into this just for love of the craft. He had interviewed Willis O'Brien's widow and was given access to all kinds of stuff for a major, I think it was 20,000 words, or it was huge piece, kind of the definitive piece on King Kong. And that stemmed from a passion he'd had for King Kong since he was 10 years old. So he had such a love of the subject matter. And I honestly think it was almost, I mean, maybe I'm underestimating Don's business plan, but my recollection is that he did it out of love and out of passion. And the fact that it ever took off and made money was kind of a happy accident.
I like that, though. I think that's typically the success stories that you'll hear about anything good is that, you've got to have that passion, that obsession behind it. And the money isn't usually going to be your metric that you're focused on, and it kind of shows with what you're doing. I love the fact that it hasn't changed, as you mentioned. The look of it throughout every issue, it's always been the same shape, the same kind of form, and it just works so well. Like I was trying to explain this to someone the other day what Cinefex magazine is, because it's not like a magazine in any essence at all. It's a collector's item. It's something that you hold, and it's got that that feeling to it of just it's documenting a part of the cinematic history. For me, like in Australia, we never had Cinefex for the longest time, and I finally found it at some random bookstore. And then later in Sydney, I found a comic book store that had it, and it was a goldmine because it was one of those untouchable things I could never actually get hold of. I could only hear about, and the first time I ever held one, I was like, wow, like this is amazing. So yeah, I think it's just like a really exciting thing that we all can relate to. I guess at the same time, like when it came to the first few issues, I mean, even the very first issue, like what was the process like going into that? I mean, I imagine, especially since it hasn't changed too much, but like going through and trying to figure out like the process to document all of this. I mean, I imagine by now you've nailed that in terms of your expectations each issue, but back then being able to get access to all the information, especially that long ago, like what was it like, I guess, the first couple of issues to be able to get access to all this information, to the people involved in the process, and having not everyone aware of like who Cinefex was at that time?
Well, in some ways it was easier, and then in another way it was a lot harder. It was easier in that, for one thing, at the time there were only about 5 visual effects companies. When Cinefex started, there was ILM. I don't even think Boss had started yet, and Boss has come and gone after a long career. So it was EEG, I think, Doug Trumbull's group. There was Apogee that John Dykstra. So there were like 3-4 visual effects companies. And then Don was kind of known, partly because of his Close Encounters article that he'd done for Cinefantastique. Everybody knew him. So as far as getting access to people, it was easy. You called them directly. They didn't have PR departments, and you know what I mean? And there were all these barriers between Dennis Murin and Doug Trumbull and all those people. Don called them, or Don showed up, and oh, hi, Don, how you doing? And so that way it was much, much easier. But the actual production of the magazine, of course, this was before digital, so it was all, I don't even know the terminology. As I said, I was just doing clerical work at the time, so I don't know what you call it. The wax paper that you put down, and it was a very analog process to do the typesetting. And if you had a correction, you'd take the razor blade and cut out that line and then paste in a new line. And it was laborious. I mean, it's unbelievable. Well, that's why it took them a year to do the first one. And so in that actual production of the magazine was harder by a long shot. Access to people was much, much easier than it is now. Now we have a lot of obstacles we have to jump over, hoops we have to jump through to get to people. Not that bad. Usually it goes pretty
I thought with Murin, you just have to stand outside of Starbucks all day until he walks in from building 1 or building 2, and it's a bit easier that way. But no, I'm just joking. But
there was a building 2 at the time.
It would have been the Kerner building back in the day.
It was a long time ago. It was a very small little place. So I don't know. I don't know if you have a perspective on this, Graham, but
well, I mean, I as the relative newcomer, I kind of stepped into a well-oiled machine, but and perhaps we can talk as we go along about the process we actually go through now. But certainly, as Jody said, we have to set up a lot of stuff ahead of time. We have to get a lot of clearances. We have to go through quite a few agencies in order to get through to the people that we need to talk to, for sure.
That's awesome. And I guess, like, I was talking about this earlier, but like, what do you think are the 5 most popular issues? I mean, again, I think it's definitely kind of difficult. You've got so many classic ones, and obviously, as time's progressed, I think there's so many iconic movies coming out every single month. But yeah, what do you think are like the most favorable with the readers in terms of the issues that have been out so far?
Number 9, Blade Runner, the Blade Runner issue. Sold out a long time ago. It may have been the first one that sold out. So that if you ever find that in a garage sale, grab it.
Will do.
Number 21, the Terminator issue, which we almost didn't cover Terminator, by the way. That was a very last minute decision to cover that. And it turned out to be one of the, because who knew, but that turned out to be a bestseller. I believe Titanic, I could be wrong about this, but I think the Titanic issue is the only one where the demand was so great, we actually went back and did a second press run on it.
Okay, I might have had the second run then. Cool.
Yeah. So those 3 come to mind, and obviously the Jurassic Park issue, number 55. Do any others come to your mind, Graham?
No, I mean, I think, the very earliest ones now are certainly highly prized and highly sought after. If you've got a pristine issue 1, then you're a lucky person.
That's cool. And I guess with Terminator 2, like, because I didn't really know too much about special effects or visual effects back then, but I remember there was like I'm assuming it was an American magazine, but there was a Terror Zone or something like that. It was more like horror makeup, stuff like that. But I just remember that was kind of where I started reading about Terminator 2 and all the special effects, makeup, and everything else that went into it. I guess like I'm kind of curious, just you mentioned that, like, what was your idea of that film at the time? Like, did you think it just wasn't really going to fit into that category of like the illusions and things that you regularly would cover?
Terminator 1 or Terminator 2?
Well, I guess you're referring to Terminator 2 as being one of the more favorable ones?
No, Terminator 1, I meant.
Okay.
The first Terminator
I can see
issues.
that. It definitely kind of went under the radar a little bit.
Yeah. Well, what happened was, Don, one thing Cinefex has never done, you'll notice we've never covered a, like, what do they call them, slasher films, or,
Yep.
you know, Don's always had just a little bit of a, and this has continued, we kind of are trying to stay out of anything that's a little too, well, I guess like slasher films and stuff.
Mhm.
Or I don't even know what to call them, but I think Don's impression just from the whatever few ads he saw was that Terminator was going to be a pretty low budget, kind of nothing movie. So he already, for issue 21, he had other editorial all lined up. I think articles already being written or were written, and then at the last minute, his then, who's now our publisher, Greg Shay, his son, wanted to go see Terminator. Don probably wouldn't even have gone to see it, except that his son, his young son, wanted to see it. And Don came back from seeing Terminator. He said, "You know what? That is a terrific film. This director has got some real potential," which I'm sure just made James Cameron's day. And so he completely scrapped what we were going to do for that issue and switched to Terminator. And thank goodness, I mean, what a legacy that's been. So
Yeah.
That was kind of by happen chance. That was just that was a last minute thing that we didn't really expect. And then it's a great cover. And I think Don even arranged a photographer to go and take that picture. I'm not sure, but so anyway, that's how that happened. So obviously, no, we didn't know, but I think Don sensed, no, this is going to be huge once he saw the movie. And that's why we covered that one.
That's really cool. And again, just curious, like, I just asked you about what were some of the fan favorites, but obviously there's going to be some episodes, or I should say issues, that are more close to your hearts. I mean, are there any particular ones both of you are extremely fond of, either from the topics covered or just behind the scenes, like some of the writing process that went into it?
You go first, Graham.
Well, certainly for me, I guess one of my favorite issues is the first one I bought as a spotty teenager back in I don't know 1982, I guess, something like that. It's issue 6, which I bought on one of my regular trips to London to Forbidden Planet Comic Shop, as it was then, just a tiny, dusty little comic shop in London's West End. And I was just browsing, and I found this strange magazine that, as Jody described, this peculiar shape, nothing on the cover except a huge photo and the logo. No clue as to what the editorial is inside. And the cover's Dragon Slayer, and I'd just seen the movie on that trip. So
and Raiders of the Lost Ark as well, right? So would have been a pretty fun issue. Yeah,
that's right. And also a kind of visionary article about the state of the art in computer graphics at the time.
It'll come and go.
Yeah,
it's just a fad.
That'll never last. So that's my most creased and beloved copy, certainly. And then I guess another one that springs to mind is the issue with my first article in, which is issue 136. I wrote the story on Rush, Ron Howard's Formula One racing film.
That's great.
And that was my baptism by fire into the Cinefex process.
That's really cool.
My first article was Cocoon, in the Cocoon issue, so that's a favorite of mine. I think that's 24. And it's one of the very few issues, if you'll notice, we hardly ever have a human being on the cover of Cinefex. Almost never. We can have gorillas, we can have spaceships, but we almost never have a human being. But there is a Dennehy, is that his name? Yeah. There is him on the revealing his alien eye there on issue 24. So for the same reason that Graham mentioned, because my first article that I ever wrote was the Cocoon article. That issue is dear to me. The Terminator 2 issue is dear to me because Don and I wrote the making of Terminator 2. So we were close to that project even before we wrote this. We wrote the Cinefex article. And then just because I love the subject matter and the effects in it so much, the Apollo 13 issue is very dear to my heart. Yeah.
I had that one too. That's awesome. And I guess with Terminator 2, knowing the success of the first one, I guess this time around you guys were a bit more prepared to dive all in on that episode and document the whole process?
You're right, we were. And because we were writing the book, which means that we were in on it like from the beginning. And as it happened, they were shooting. They shot a lot of it at an abandoned steel mill out here in the Inland Empire. So for once in our lives, instead of having to drive 2 hours to get to a movie set, it was a hop, skip, and a jump for us. And Don and I spent a lot of time on the set. And and then Don had a very good relationship with Cameron by then. So we were well prepared because we'd already written the whole book about it. So writing an 1,000-word article about it seemed like just focusing on the effects was. And then I've got a real fondness. I spent a lot of time with the what was then Stan Winston's studio people because of the Terminator issue, and so we had a long-standing relationship with Stan and his guys. And of course, they did all those practical effects for Terminator 2. So. Yeah, that was a great experience.
That's really cool. And so you guys actually wrote the behind-the-scenes book on Terminator 2 as well?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I love that. I've got it in the other room, so that's great. That's really cool. And what was it like at the time? I mean, again, it is one of those iconic films that, I think there was a big shift, both obviously for CGI, but, special effects, makeup, everything that went into that film. I mean, for you guys, like, was that one of those films that you knew would kind of hold its own 10 years down the line and have like a kind of be the catalyst for a lot of shifts in the industry?
I think so, but I think of young Sherlock Holmes, which had a little bit of CGI work in it, the Stained Glass Man, and then Terminator 2, of course, had the liquid metal Terminator, so it was that. It still felt kind of fringy, though. Digital did. It was kind of like maybe what VR was, like maybe a couple of years ago or 5 years ago. It still felt fringe. That's fringe stuff. Yeah. But they're still like, this is the core of how you do it. It wasn't really until Jurassic Park that it exploded. It went from being fringe to mainstream, I guess. So I'm not sure any of us completely. Well, I know. I mean, I remember Dennis Muren said, he knew that digital was the future. He just didn't know the future was going to come so dang quickly, It happened a lot faster than anybody thought it would because of the home computer thing. If you had to do this work on the equivalent of Craig supercomputers, that wasn't going to go anywhere very fast. I don't think anybody foresaw, or few people foresaw, that computer power like that was going to get so democratized so that everybody would have it. And in fact, I remember for a couple of years, there was a whole unit at ILM called the Mac unit that was working on shots.
Yeah, the Rebel unit, right?
Right, the Rebel unit. And for a couple of years there, we were not allowed to mention them.
That's so common too. Like it's funny, but like desktop PCs, things like that, like Animal Logic, I can say that now 20 years later, but like back in 1999, let's say, that would be their typical thing. They'd bring directors around, they'd show the two Silicon Graphics machines down the bottom. Everything else would be like 3D Studio Max on a Windows machine, like a whole level above. But, you would never mention that because it's kind of the, the whole, I guess brand of like trying to make yourself bigger than you are, So right. Keeping those secrets.
I was at Macworld Digital once, and Craig Barron showed me his the graveyard of Silicon Graphics machines. Because evidently what happened, I remember this the way he put it to me, is that people invested millions of dollars in this stuff, and they were really obsolete within a couple of years, So if people had just waited for Apple to get going and things like that for a couple more years, they could have saved themselves a lot of money. But that was just the evolution, that's how it went.
Well, it's kind of like, for the longest time, if you look at Flame and Inferno, all the old discrete workstations. Like you would invest $1 million into one of these, and it isn't to say that it was the best. It was more to do with you're buying the name, because then people will come around because it's like, oh, I get to sit and have coffee and sit on a couch and talk about cricket or football with this guy while he comps our work and does it all on a Flame, and I get to go and tell everyone how we comped it on Flame. So it's a kind of a status thing that comes with it.
Yeah, it was partly to impress movie studio executives and and producers. That's really what it partly was for. It's like, ooh, and also so out of the realm of what they understood. It made it seem like, wow, these are wizards that have the secret to something that we don't understand.
Yeah,
it's a little harder to pull that off now.
Yeah, well, I think like Maya too. Maya was one of those when it first came out that especially like Lord of the Rings about to come out around the corner. Was one of those like, this is the future. Again, like just having that brand. Certain things were a buzzword that you could kind of use that as a selling point. Like, oh, do you use this or do you have this? And yeah, it's. I think these days it's so diluted that it's funny. Like I live on a street where in Portland, so like half of my street's Nike, and then I got some Autodesk and Intel people, and again, like Autodesk being one of the biggest software companies in the world, they'll look at a lot of their Maya, Max, things like that, all their software, and it's not. I think that people take it for granted these days. It's such a mainstream tool that it isn't one of their bigger products compared to construction, things like that. So what was like state of the art, like Terminator 2 was, I think, the first feature film, if I believe, to use Photoshop, and unless I'm remembering that wrong, but yeah, I mean, again, those are now words that we use day to day in everything that we do. So what was originally a pretty pivotal piece of software that only the few would have access to is now like an app on your phone.
Exactly.
Yeah, and certainly now, I mean, we'll always ask. As a matter of course, in the interviews, we'll ask, well, just talk us through the pipeline that you're using on this show. And it's fairly rare these days that something new will come up. People are modeling in Maya and they're rendering in Katana and RenderMan and lighting and so on, and effects in Houdini. And occasionally someone will pop up with an interesting wrinkle. Oh, actually, we actually brought out Flame for this one because that gave us a particular edge for these shots. And then very, very occasionally something new will come up. But generally, the industry has matured, and so all that. And we certainly don't ask, well, what machines were you using? What was the power of the CPU and how much RAM did you have in there? Because the industry has just matured to the point where that's irrelevant. That's not what we want to be writing about, and it's certainly not what people want to be reading about.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
There were kind of, it reminds me of the war that went on for a while there between Betamax and VHF, VHS, I mean, and, finally VHS emerged the winner. And in the early days, there was kind of this, like before Maya, there was soft image, and everybody was using soft image, and that seemed like that. And then, Maya kind of took precedence. But yeah, like Graham was saying, it's all kind of settled now. And that's why if someone does do something new or develops a new piece of software, or there is some new approach taken, as writers, Joe and Graham and I jump on that like a cat on a cat toy, because you have to really look for those things. And because otherwise you're just writing the same thing over and over again. So we really do seek out those new approaches, not just new software, because that's a little boring too, but if there's some kind of new way they found to do something, we really try to highlight that in the articles.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because that's probably, whenever I'm doing talks at events, like that's probably one of the biggest questions that comes up in Q&A at the end is like, what's the best software? What should I be using? And it's just, to me, it's such a stupid question because they've all copied each other enough times now that they all do the same thing. And, I always think of like Stephen King when he get asked in panels, like, what pen do you write with? And, as if magically that's going to, make you better at what you do.
That's a good analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, it's kind of funny because you're right. Like it has matured to the point where all of this, there are certain I guess routines that people go through, and you're right. Like you pick up a project, you're gonna do all your previs, you're gonna do all your post-viz, the whole pipeline. I'm sure you guys know this more than anyone. Like you probably see a lot of commonalities between almost every single studio. They're going to be one of a couple of different models of how they work, and it's not all that different. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, when it was kind of this exploratory time, I think it was really fascinating. I mean, for me, like if I would see movies just because they had a visual effects shot in the film or whatever, and now like I'm kind of enjoying the films that don't have as much in there. So and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But
and could I just to interject there quickly, Alan? And the thing is, ultimately, from our point of view, none of that matters because what we're after is the story. Mm-hmm. Because whether the artist is using Houdini or Maya or their hands and a tube of super glue or a load of bungee cord and some scaffolding, it doesn't matter. The thing that matters is the ingenious thinking that they're using to solve the problem of how do I get these illusions on the screen. And that's the thing that hasn't changed over the years, and that's where the story is that we'll always be trying to dig up.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. That's really great. And I guess for both of you, I'm just curious after you guys talking about this, like what were the first movie sets you both got to go on for Cinefex?
Gosh, for me, wow.
I can't recall the first time I was on a movie set myself, so...
Thank you, that makes me feel better, because you gotta understand we're going back 40 years now almost, so, but, the ones that stand out are the Terminator 2, and then we weren't really so much on the set for Jurassic... Well, we're on a lot of sets for Jurassic Park, but not when they were in Hawaii. We didn't go to Hawaii with them, but we were there when they were shooting on stage for things. Gosh, that's hard to remember the first ones, but I just remember when I was starting out, and this was all so new to me, this had not been my world at all. Mainly, I just stood in a corner in terror that I was going to walk through a shot or talk when I wasn't supposed to or something. So I made myself as invisible as at all possible. That's what I remember. Don't trip on the cables and don't walk through a shot. That's all I was thinking about it.
I mean, it's fair to say we don't get out to the sets very much these days. Certainly in my time at Cinefex, that's a pretty rare occurrence. I do, just going back to that first article, the memories just come back. For the Rush article that I wrote, I interviewed the visual effects supervisor, Jody Johnson, who at the time had moved on to In the Heart of the Sea. So he'd moved from one Ron Howard production to another. And I went to see him at Leavesden Studios, just north of London. And it was very hard sitting in the room trying to interview him about Rush that he'd been working on kind of 6 or 12 months previously, surrounded by all this gorgeous production art of whales coming out of the sea and these sailing ships creaking across the waves. And I just wanted to keep leaping up and pointing to these pictures and saying, Jody, can you just tell me what this is? And what's this scene or what's these storyboards? These look fantastic. And knowing that Ron Howard was kind of in the other building directing someone in a water tank, plunging up and down, pretending they were on the high seas. So distractions can be tricky in interviews. Often you're better off, I don't know if Jody would agree, but often you can be better off doing your interviews and in just a grey box, just with minimum distractions so you can keep focused on the task at hand.
And that's why Graham's Rush article has all these references to water tank work. So it's very confusing.
Going back to Jurassic Park for a moment, but Jody, can you talk a little bit about what it was like documenting that film? Again, I think there's no more iconic film for many different reasons, but what was that experience like working on? Yeah.
Jurassic Park? Oh, okay. Well, again, Don and I wrote The Making of Jurassic Park, the book. And they were smart enough. They did something that I've written 12 making of books now. And Jurassic Park and Terminator 2 were the only ones where they actually said, We want this done right. So please come on. And I think we came on to that one. They were still in pre-production. They were still drawing things and everything. So because we had that long year of being on Jurassic Park before the movie came out, and before we had to write I had to write the Jurassic Park article. I had such a rich backstory there, and such a rich history with the project, which, God, it would be wonderful if we had that with everything that we wrote. But of course, you can't have that unless you've spent a year and you wrote the making of book. So that was kind of a joy, because I really got it in an organic sort of way. Just because I'd been on it so long and had talked to so many people and had sat in the art department rooms and seen the art on the walls, and been at stands when they were building the T-Rex and all of that, So that was also, we knew it was going to be a game changer. This was, like I said, if digital had been on the fringes up to now, it was about ready to go mainstream, and it was going to be a huge deal and shake up the industry and the artistry and the technology completely. So it was very exciting. It was kind of like, I had an opportunity to see Titanic, the movie. Like, Don and I got invited to a pretty special screening, I think 3 months before the movie came out. Wow. And those 3 months were just horrible, because for 3 months you're just having to keep your mouth shut and sit on this thing that is going to just explode and be huge. And that's how it was with the Jurassic Park issue too, and with Jurassic Park, just knowing that something was about to be unleashed on the world, and they had no idea. And so it was exciting.
That's great. And in terms of game changers, as you mentioned before, like, what are some of the other films you think have been like really big game changers that really pushed the needle in terms of redefining the filmmaking process over the past 40 years? just dropping that one on you.
Well, this is related to the whole digital thing, but I remember the first digital cameras on a set. I think it was for the first ones I saw where I was actually there was for one of the second trilogy of Star Wars movies. And I mean, what a pain in the neck those things were. Huge cables, huge. They had to be connected. And it was like, oh my gosh. And it was hard to believe that was going to. So I think that being all worked out and so that it's now not only as user-friendly, but probably more user-friendly than the old film cameras were.
Superman Returns, we did that. We used the Genesis camera for that. So it was Thomas Newton, who DP'd that, and it's again, like, you're right, just cables and not enough hard drives at any given moment. So I mean, looking at it now, like, I've got a Red sitting right behind me. It's just, I actually carried it on a backpack the other day, and I'm like, wow, I can carry a LiDAR scanner, a Red camera, multiple lenses, drone, and all this other stuff in a backpack. And times have definitely changed.
And then I'll let Graham talk here about this, but what's happening with virtual production now, kind of starting somewhat with Avatar, and but it's just being refined. I was, if you can call it, the set. I was on the set. It was actually just a small black box for The Lion King that's coming out next year. And it's just astonishing. They've got it all set up now so that if you've been in the analog world as a DP your whole life, you feel just as comfortable as can be. And I put on the glasses and got to fly over the plains of Africa and all of that. So wow. I think that's becoming, and has been for a while, but that's becoming an unbelievable change in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, certainly virtual production comes into almost every film we cover, both large and small. I mean, I covered, what did I cover? Warcraft was maybe one of the first big virtual production films I covered. And the story to be told there is just immense. And it's easy, it will be easy to to write an entire Cinefex article just on that. And with that particular example, the size differential between the orcs and the humans, and the various remapping and processes that went on, and positioning characters in the in the simulcam feed, or putting Hulk on the set in a Marvel Studios film. But then even down to using that to preview sets, for example, the whole virtual scouting process. I covered Solo earlier this year and spoke with James Klein, the ILM art director, and he was talking about the train, the Convey X train that speeds through the mountains, and he designed this thing. And the filmmakers were saying, well, it's got these two carriages on it, sort of on opposing sides. Do you think the characters could jump from one carriage to the other? And he's saying, well, I don't know. I have no idea. So he went down to the ILM X Lab virtual stage and put his simple blocky 3D model into it, and put a set of goggles on, and the X-Lab guys were saying, we haven't really had anybody jump around in our volume before. Can you just be careful? So he tried it out. So he jumped from one train carriage to the next and said, yep, you can do that.
That's great.
So it really permeates every part of production, from design through to production, through to post. Absolutely.
That's so cool. And in terms of iconic films, like, do you think Lord of the Rings or Matrix, like some of those also come to mind? In terms of ones that, for one reason or another, have kind of had some big impact?
I think The Matrix is absolutely up there. For me personally, in terms of, wow, I never saw that before. I've never seen that before. I mean, that's the holy grail of every visual effects supervisor, or it's the thing that every visual effects supervisor is asked to deliver. Perhaps is more accurate, and that certainly delivered them in spades. And Lord of the Rings. Just the combination of literally every trick in the book at a scale that had never been seen before, and inventing new tricks that nobody had thought up before, including, of course, virtual production techniques, but also folding in all the old kind of forced perspective stuff, and developing, massive armies that we'd never seen before.
Yeah, I think that also just the fact that, I mean, Lord of the Rings specifically, you've got a studio that had been doing some stuff behind the scenes in film before, but obviously they're outside of the bubble. They're not in London, they're not in LA specifically for film, so therefore, like, having someone just pop up in New Zealand kind of probably was one of those pivotal moments of, yes, the rest of the world gets the chance to play in this game as well, which I think was pretty great.
Yes, and that global workflow and the logistics that goes hand in hand with that is, of course, one of the biggest revolutions, I would say, in the last maybe 10 years. I mean, take any recent Marvel Studios film, and that's really kind of a poster child for the whole global workflow thing. You've got 16 vendors working around the world. The production visual effects department is literally working 24/7. You've got reviews happening 24/7. The clock never stops. And all the software and all the logistical techniques that allow you to achieve that, CineSyncs are just a matter of course, aren't they? All the collaboration tools.
Yeah.
It would be hard to imagine that's kind of not sexy stuff in a way, because it's not about the images that end up on the screen, but it is, because it facilitates that at
That's right.
an extraordinarily high level of detail at an extraordinarily high volume.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that I think globalization in a way is like so overdue, and I think that for the longest time, like, that was always the thing, that if you weren't in LA, if you weren't in London, New York, if it was more commercials or design pieces, but if you weren't in one of those pockets, then you just weren't part of the, unless you're in like an outsourcing country. That's kind of how the structure's always been, and it's definitely shifted pretty phenomenally recently. I actually interviewed Rory McGregor, the CEO of CineSync, I think last week, and yeah, it's kind of fun just talking about that, because again, you kind of take some of these tools for granted that are literally like, every studio on the planet, would do this. You would I loved at ILM that you would actually get access to all the CineSync sessions, so you wouldn't be sitting in there with Cameron, but you would be able to watch afterwards, him scream at what's wrong with your shot. And but I think that again, it's all these tools that are really linking up the world, and I think in a lot of ways it is or has been naive to think that, let's say, Los Angeles can only be the people who do visual effects. And again, like, you look at that, then San Francisco was obviously one of those outsiders that kind of, proved that it doesn't need to be all in Hollywood. And bit by bit, it's kind of now shifted to Vancouver being the capital, and now all these other countries are getting to do a lot more and have a lot more influence on things. So I love the fact personally that the entire world now gets to play in this game and do a lot of the film production. Okay, I hope you enjoy that episode. Again, thanks to Jody and Graham for taking the time to chat. This is just part 1 of 2. There's going to be another episode out later this week, so keep an eye out for that. Now, if you want to check out the show notes, go to alanmckay.com/170, and you'll be able to access the show notes as well as links to everything that we talk about in this episode. In addition to that, I highly suggest checking out cinefex.com. I'll link to it in the show notes to get the latest issue of Cinefex magazine. So, that being said, I'll be back next episode. Until then, rock on.